Grappling with Gray, a forum for promoting the development of an ethical mindset and ethical decision making to help us clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Yonason Goldson, and I'd like to welcome my guests. Steve Edner is a serial entrepreneur who flunked retirement. He became a business professor and mentor at St. Louis University. He is also the godfather of Grappling with Gray. So we wouldn't be here without you, Steve. Thank you so much. We have Catherine Fitzgerald back again at the last minute. Thank you for stepping into the breach, Catherine. Catherine has survived her own leadership roles as CEO and mother of 3 boys. As owner of Catapult Leadership Group, she now dedicates herself to working with organizational leaders as they navigate the choppy waters of aligning people, performance, and profits. And we have Kimi Hirotsu-Zimski. Did I get that right?
He does. It's wonderful.
Okay. Who is the founder of KSP Partnership, developing and delivering project management and project leadership courses. Thank you all for being here today. And let's jump right in with our ethical scenario. Anyone even tangentially associated with education is familiar with the phenomenon of grade inflation, where a C used to stand for competent but uninspired work. It now stands in place of D or F, either of which is viewed as an academic nuclear button. Participation trophies are the norm in baseball and soccer, lest some children feel less accomplished than others, even if they are. Complicate matters. Classroom instructors are under pressure to not only inflate students' grades, but to write glowing recommendations, even if this forces their testimonials into the realm of fiction or fantasy. In a few celebrated cases, disgruntled students and parents filed lawsuits against instructors who dared to issue a grade the student actually earned. Many instructors have given up the fight and acquiesced to the unpleasant reality. They simply don't believe it's worth subjecting themselves to angry calls, pressure from administrators, and the specter of litigation. But more than that, they may rationalize that grade inflation is necessary for those good but unexceptional students who will find themselves competing with other good but unexceptional students. If students from other schools enjoy the benefit of inflated grades and fancifully written recommendations, why should their own students appear lackluster because they were honestly evaluated? What should a teacher do? Provide an honest assessment, or go with the flow of inflated grades and hyperbolic reference letters? The floor is open.
Oh my goodness. So I do teach, but I don't usually run into people's parents because they're mostly adult and in the workplace. And so what I do run into, though, rather than grade inflation, is what I call education deflation. And that is when people have exams, they get incredibly stressed out. And so my dilemma is, do I help them out by being very directive about what type of things are going to be covered on the exam? Or do I focus on their learning experience only and ignore the exam, understanding that they're all under stress? They're actually not participating in the learning experience the way I like them to. So it gave us this scenario. I remember thinking, ouch, is he even looking over my shoulder?
Well, there's always that tension between the process of learning, the mastery of the subject, and the form of evaluation, which are frequently not in sync with one another.
That's so true.
So I'll jump in.
Please.
One of the things that makes my life easier is I teach in the Graduate School of Business at St. Louis University. And when I started teaching, my rule to the university was I'll only teach grad classes and I'll only teach electives. By doing that, I always have students who want to be there. And they are interested in learning and not in grades, which makes it very different. But I do believe at the lower levels, high school and below, that the problem is probably that school boards who hire teachers and enforce all of these rules are elected by parents who want their kids to do well, and nobody is standing behind the teachers. I think that it would be much better, and you see this all the time, if the teachers were actually supported by the school boards and the parents instead of always fought with. And I'll stop there, and I'll let Catherine jump in, but then I'll make more comments later.
Well, that's that could be a whole other topic. I taught for 20 years here in St. Louis at a private Jewish school, and when I was being interviewed, I was prepared for one of the common questions they asked: what do you see as your greatest asset as a teacher? And I said, discipline and classroom management. And you should have seen the eyes around the room light up, smiles spread across their faces. I wasn't aware that the school had been in somewhat of a state of crisis the year before. And everybody wanted someone to come in who would be able to control these kids. Well, a few months later, half of them were calling me to be fired because they wanted other people's children disciplined, not their children. So I'm very much on board with your comments, Steve, but Kevin, can you bring us back to this idea of adjusting standards, or you're evaluating differently, with the sense that either I want to avoid coming under fire myself, or perhaps putting up my own students at a disadvantage because they're not going to be, because the competing students are not going to be judged fairly.
It's, I sat here listening to the whole thing, and I'm the mother of 3 boys, and my eldest is in grad school as we speak, and my youngest is still in college. My middle has graduated from college, and I was married to an educator for 25 years. My mother has a master's in education, has taught at all levels, from kindergarten, from elementary, preschool, all the way through graduate school. And my sister has a doctorate from Columbia in early childhood education and has taught both at the elementary and college level. And so I have been around these conversations a lot in my life. And as a parent, I was raised with an idea that education is a gift, and that if you, it's kind of what you put into it, you get out of it. And I also, in my business life, have known many people who have not had, I should back up and say, I introduced myself as the flunky of the family because I don't have any letters after my name. I just got a college degree. But I say, I've known many people who have not done well in school and have done phenomenally in life. And so as I sit and listen to the argument on both sides, there's, a lot of things. I empathize with the teacher because I've been surrounded by them who have been faced with those choices. But ultimately, I feel like it's a disservice to the student if we are not accurately assessing them. And I think that the assessment inflation has happened as a result of the financial support they get based on their achievements as an institution, not as an educator. So even in my children's education, and part of it was in private school and part of it was in public school, there was a lot of teaching to the test in order to get the statistical outcome that shows we are good educators, not to educate the children. So, or the students, I should say, at any level. So largely, I think it starts at home with the mindset of the parent to say, you are being given the gift of education. You have an opportunity here to learn and to grow and to explore, and I support you in all of that. And I support your teachers. I mean, I don't know about you, but I grew up in a time when if I got in trouble at school, it was like nothing compared to what was going to happen when I got home. So that's my 12 cents. Worth what you paid for it, Yonason.
So if I may jump again, and I understand that you want to talk about rate inflation, but I think the inflation has been caused by the school boards who want their schools to look like they do better. And I know that when my kids were in school, and my baby's 45, so I've not had to deal with this for a long time. But the fact even then that we would go in and talk to the teacher and say, hey, what can we do to help? It was like we were from outer space. Nobody else ever asked those questions. And so I think Catherine's right. Until the parents support the teachers, rate inflation is going to be a reality. And it may not be right, but it is reality.
If I may, I think part of the issue comes down to risk management. And if you have chosen to go into this field, which already has a number of challenges in it, let's face it, they are underpaid. Even at being underpaid, they are so poorly supported with in terms of supplies and tools that many of them, if not all of them, in some way, shape, or form, subsidize the very organizations they're supposed to be working for. And yet, standing on their principle could mean standing in line at the unemployment office. And that's always going to be really, really tough. It's probably one of the best cases that you could make for teaching financial literacy to children so that they understand that understanding mathematics and understanding how this all works is also a way to build your safety net. It's a whole lot easier, I'm sorry, to stand on your principles when it's not going to have you entering the door of the unemployment or worrying about how you're going to be.
And that's where it makes people like me, it's easier for me to stand up. I'm retired. If St. Louis University said tomorrow you can't teach here anymore because you're giving away too many C's. Okay, I don't care. So I will stand up and tell them, what, the emperor has no clothes. Now, the other thing that I think is important, there's another side to this whole story, and that's the employers. If employers start out by doing a look at only your grades before they'll interview you, that's a problem. If they'll look at what you've accomplished and ignore grades, then grade inflation may be meaningless. When I interviewed people, I had attended a program by Bill Marriott, the Marriott Corporation. And one of the things he said is if you hire attitude, you can teach any skill you need. And I believe in that. I don't worry about the grades of the students I'm hiring. In fact, I hire kids who just graduated high school and never went to college. They have the right attitude because they're the ones who are going to be the superstars.
I think one of the things that impacts grades too is that our system is set up for people who learn a certain way, and we all learn differently. And we have, auditory, visual, or tactile learners. And in a situation where you have somebody who's not an auditory learner, as I am not a primary auditory learner, it is a challenge for them. I have to see it, I have to touch it, I have to read it, I have to write it. That's how it gets in my brain. I know that now. I didn't know that then. And many teachers are, given curriculum based on the state mandate. And they have to teach it in the way that the state has, given them guidelines to do. And that takes all the creativity out of teaching. It also takes all the customization of learning and educating out of the process. And so you end up with teachers who are frustrated because they see this child needs something different than what they can give them. And they are being held accountable to a standard that is set and a methodology of how to teach it. And we have to all be on the same page at the same time and moving forward. And some kids don't learn as quickly as others. And so you have a teacher always grappling with the gray. Because do I follow what the administration is telling me has to happen? Or do I do what is best for my student? And how do I navigate that and maintain my sanity and my own employment. So I agree with Kimmy. It is a situation where you really have to be in a position to be able to stand your ethical grounds.
And if I may, I like what you just said. It's very important because in the lower level schools, you do teach to a test. I have grandchildren in New York, and they have to take the regents every year to be able to go from one grade to the next. And that's what they teach. They don't teach them how to think.
Right.
And for example, when you get to the final exams, the two most important questions on the finals I give, and I don't give multiple choice questions, and I have open book. It says, what were the 2 or 3 most important things you learned this semester? And then how are those things going to affect the rest of your life? Well, it makes the students sit back and think. And and by the way, there's a third question, which is what grade do you think you deserve? And it's amazing that when they go through the process of being forced to think about what happened, how honest they are in their grade assessments.
I think that's very important. I also think that to a certain extent, the whole discussion about grade inflation is, we're having to have this discussion because of the stealthy way, the whole attitude, I'm going to say the E word, the attitude of entitlement kind of snuck in. That there was a very stealthy but steady growth in where people thought that it was a good idea. And, very frequently, and I'm just going to put this out there, I think that reasonable people sometimes look at the situation and say, oh my God, this is insane. Surely it's not going to continue. And guess what? It did.
Right.
We're very good at identifying the problems here.
Okay, let me take a stab at
Go ahead.
the potential solution. I'll put myself in the shoes of someone, say, teaching at the high school level, because
Yeah, and opposed to the solutions for changing the system, which might take a while. But the teacher is right now in the moment in this situation.
if the teacher is in this position and they became a teacher because they believe in the value that they can bring to the lives of the students, then I suspect that that dilemma is slightly less sharp. It's still there. I'm not going to, it's still there. But perhaps what we are looking at is a situation where people don't actually seem to ask instructors, what does this dilemma mean to you? What does this push me, pull you dynamic between ethics of your own and ethics surrounding the social impact of this? Have you given it thought? What does it mean to you? And what do you think we should, as an organization, do it? I think if you got into that business because you believed in the power of the impact you can make in that business, there's a slightly less sharp edge to what do I do? You do what is ethically right by your own values and by your own standards.
Kimmy, can I ask you a question, please? I remember way back when in prehistoric times.
Watch it, I think we're the same age.
Okay, well, I doubt it, but I'll accept that you think I'm that young. But in the prehistoric times, we were always graded on a bell curve. And you knew that there were going to be as many F's as there were A's, as many B's as there were D's. And C meant you got it. You just weren't at the top of the class or the bottom of the class. Do we force schools to go back to a bell curve?
Be adverse to it. I think that it is more honest because it keeps the students and the instructors in an environment where it is a lot less global in its impact. In terms of, am I going to really worry about whether or not somebody's going to get a job when they're 35, when they're in my Western Civ class and they're 14? they have the capacity to understand the impact of these seismic shifts that happen because people did or didn't do a certain thing. And I don't know if you're a fan of this, but I was an enormous fan of Sir Ken Robinson.
You remind me, I had a colleague in high school. He said, our job isn't to teach these kids anything. Our job is to get them to the point where someone else can teach them.
I was kind of hoping that happened before high school.
Yeah, well, that was high school, and I didn't particularly like that framing of it, but I think that he was onto something. And it's when we've been talking about it and around it that really the most important thing we can teach students is to learn.
As you were all talking, I was thinking, you know, from a black and white, I hate to be a broken record here, from a black and white standpoint, what we have done is we have operationalized and created a business model in education in this country. And, you know, when you look back at what is education, what is it? Well, I mean, let's talk about Socrates. They sat around and discussed things and listened to each other's ideas and thought big thoughts and then shared them. And we're still reading them today. And so when you talk about education, what we've done is put it in a box and said, you get an A, a B, a C, a D, an E, and F, whatever.
And here's your checklist.
And if you do these things, then we'll let you go to the next level and learn some more. And if you do these things at a certain level, then you can get into college. And if you get into college and you want to go to grad school, God forbid you should get a C. I mean, I have a child in undergrad that wants to go to law school, and he is telling me, oh my God, Mom, I can't talk to you right now. I have 6 essays due in the next 2 weeks, and they're 3,000, and I can't get anything less than a B, and I don't want to wreck my GPA, you know. And it's like, we are stressing these kids out about something that should be so organic that, you know, learning is good.
And fun.
And being curious is the right way to live your life. And we've taken it out so far out of that realm that it's all about the end result. It's not about the process. And education is about the process. It is not about the end result.
But remember what happened to Socrates.
I'm so glad you're the one that said that.
I'll give you some hope to give your child.
Okay.
When I applied for graduate school, and I did it after I sold my business and was going to retire, and they looked at my grade point from my undergraduate, you know, almost 40 years earlier, and they said, you know, you really don't have the grades to get into grad school. And I said, okay, so what? Well, you can take the GREs, but let's first, how much financial aid are you going to need? I said, I'm going to write you a check for $30,000 today if you accept me. They said, you're in. You know, so right away, grades are only meaningful if you let them be overly meaningful. Now, I didn't care if I got in or not, but they wanted their $30,000, which is all grad school cost at that time. And it was an easy decision. But sometimes I want to go back to the ethics of teaching students, because I think this rises above the grades. So when I started teaching, I don't have a background in education. I'm a nerd. Okay, so I studied computer science. My master's is in industrial technology, but I knew what I liked and how I learned. So I had another professor sit on one of my classes. He said, Steve, you're teaching an inverse classroom. And I said, I never heard that term before. But what we do is I figured so many teachers read from the book and then send the students home to do their homework. So I told my students, if you want to lecture from the book, buy the book on tape. I'm not going to lecture from the book. But in class, we're going to do homework, because that's where you get stuck. And that's where I can help you the best. And so I break up the class into groups, and they would work on their homework together, and I would circulate around. My longest lecture was like 10 minutes. And then we worked on problems. And I believe, because of the answers I got for the finals, that I made an impact in their life, in the way they look at life and the way they'll learn in the future. And that's the ethical dilemma. I gave up worrying about grades. I worried about, did I make an impact?
Yes, I agree 100%.
I
That's
think
what it's about.
That is why most of us get into this business. We think we can help. And the thing is, Catherine's absolutely right. Not just for me, as an educator in the adult education, you know, the professional realms, but for a number of folks, education has become a business. And what people are trying to accomplish, I'll be upfront, it's not pretty in far too many cases. You know, I have letters behind my name, and you know what they're worth? Nothing. Not a thing. I will put my 30 years as a project manager up against anybody who's got more letters. And I know people who collect them. I think there's
That's a whole other story.
that is a whole other story. But I think that focus is one of the things that can drive a more ethical answer to this particular dilemma. Is you have to go back to why you're doing this to begin with. And if one more person tells me they're doing it because they're going to make a difference in the world, so help me God, I'm going to smack them.
I know this at the Academy Awards.
I know. I just realized I was starting to pull a Will Smith. The thing is that I truly believe that if you set your objectives for being in the teaching profession, which is essentially helping people to discover how cool it is to be curious and to learn, you get into that with objectives that are rationally set, a stretch, but achievable. You're not going to worry about aspects of this kind of dilemma that, frankly, you don't have any control over anyway. You can't contribute it to it in either fashion by making it better or worse, because ultimately, to Steve's point, it's not going to matter. And to Catherine's point, gee, that's just charming. In your job as an educator, you are teaching the students how to deal with stress management. I'm sorry, that wasn't the topic I signed up for. You know, so I think clarity, get clear on why you're doing what you're doing. And yes, there are going to be ethical dilemmas. There are always going to be ethical dilemmas. It's part fun and it's part sad and it's part the way we grow as human beings in life.
Absolutely. And you know, ultimately, when you make the hard choices, and I look back in my high school days, there were a few teachers that made huge impacts on my life and my choices. One in particular, my high school teacher, who was my humanities teacher, Mr. Donahue. I remember him like right now. And he's the reason I went to UCLA as an English major, because I learned how to craft a story and write and think and contemplate and, you know, create analogies and all of the word pictures that I could think of. And he was just an anchor in my life. And I'm blessed in that I live in a small town. And when I came back, I got to see him after I had graduated and spend time, you know, in social circles. I'd run into him and it was always like, oh, you know, and, but that time in life was not, I was not even thinking about my GPA as much as I was thinking about learning to think and to write and to do. And that's the thing that I feel like my kids have kind of been robbed by. They're always focused on the outcome and not on the process. And I'm blessed in that I have 3 really good thinkers, but in my children, but I think
you might
that
have had a little something to do.
but I really feel that, you know, as an educator, you have to think in terms of your students as your number 1 priority. And also realize that if you are singled out because you have stood on your ethical code and made the decision to grade according to their actual achievement, and you are brought out and maybe fired, maybe moved on, or maybe fights with parents. You know, the bottom line is you are teaching your children even in those actions. And that moves our society forward. And I'm also feeling like, you know, we don't, nothing happens by accident in our life. We have things happen and we have choices. We can either move forward and learn, or we can stand back in fear. And I think this dilemma, in terms of ethical dilemma, is no dilemma if they are a heart-centered, dedicated educator. And
They're
that's what
clear
we need
about
more
what
of.
they're doing. Yeah, if they're clear about why they're doing what they're doing, as opposed to how they're doing what they're doing. If they're clear about the why, they'll figure out the how. There are instructors and teachers in all sorts of places who absolutely understand their obligation to the organizations that they're working in, but also will take the time and trouble to be a little more creative, to try different approaches, to reach the students who have different learning capacities and different learning styles. We don't all have to wait to the point where we're teaching at Steve's level. By level, I meant the, you know, the hierarchy of students.
Right.
I'm still trying to get to your level of actual, you know, facilitation, but I'm working on it.
But you know what, and that's why the whole conversation is a little tough for me, because I don't deal with grade inflation. You know, every student, I teach a corporate innovation class, and every student must do a project that will earn their company or save them $50,000 in the first year. And they must make a presentation to their boss of their idea.
I love it.
You know, they are really incented to do a good job, and they pay attention in class, and they want help in perfecting their presentation, because this could make a difference to their future.
And the world.
And it's a practical application of all sorts of things that could happen in 5 or 6 different books, but it's not going to have nearly the same impact as the experience of learning what this is all about.
I'm having a wonderful time letting you folks run with this. We are at the end of our time, at least the first segment. I usually ask my guests to sum up, but I think you've all done that so eloquently. That I just want to leave you with a couple of closing thoughts. When I taught high school, I gave multiple choice questions with more than one possible answer. So there was no process of elimination. Five choices, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of them could be true. And boy, did those kids complain and moan.
Struggle, yes.
And then I heard that some of them had gone on to advanced college courses where they had multiple choice questions with more than one possible answer. And their contemporaries were pulling their hair out. How are we supposed to do that? And my students were, yeah, we had really Goldson. We don't have to worry about this.
I love it.
That's
So,
great.
I mean, the heart of the ethical issue that I think you all articulated so wonderfully is that our first ethical obligation is to prepare our students for life. And if that means that we may not collaborate in their attainment of the short-term goals that they're looking for, we may and probably have served them much better. And I agree with you, Catherine, things happen for a reason, and these things usually do work themselves out. And one topic that I would like to get into, perhaps in the next segment, is something that you touched on, Steve, that one of the problems here is the livelihood. It's my job could be threatened if I don't play the game. And when it comes to making ethical decisions, and this, there may be limited practicality here. If I want to go into teaching, I know I'm not going to have the type of financial security or stability that I might if I went into the private sector. But looking for ways to insulate ourselves from the consequences of doing the right thing. I think that is something that perhaps we could pursue in our next segment. So I really would like to thank you all. It's been a really engaging discussion, and I hardly had to do anything. So that was the best part of all. So I'd like to thank Kimi, Catherine, and Steve again for being with me. And I do hope you all join me again at some point. Catherine, you already have. So.
My pleasure.
For those of you watching, listening, if you'd like to suggest an ethical scenario or dilemma for discussion, please go to my website, YonasonGoldson.com. Use the contact box to submit your proposal, and we may take up your ethical question or scenario. If you are a Grappling with a Grading member, please use the community link to participate in a follow-up Q&A with our panelists. They can stick around. If you're not a member, please go to gwtg.live. That's gwtg.live. We can sign up for a free 30-day trial and enjoy member benefits. Please join us again next week for another ethical discussion as our panel grapples with the gray.